The vast, unblinking eye of the sky over the frontier had been a hard, dusty blue for weeks. It made the land tired, and it made Maeve tired, too. She worked her late husband's spread, a lonesome stitch of grass and timber tucked between two whispering ridges, with a doggedness that was more habit than hope. Each day was a solitary circle from porch to coop, from coop to pasture, and back again, the silence broken only by the lowing of cows, the sigh of the wind, and the heavy thump of her own heart in her ears. The change came not with a gentle warning, but with a sudden, violent snarl from the west. The horizon, so clear an hour before, curdled into a bruised purple and green. The wind, once a friend, turned mean, whipping Maeve's skirts around her legs and hurling grit into her eyes. She'd just finished securing the chickens when the first fat, cold drops began to fall, exploding in the dust like tiny bullets. Then the sky ripped open. Rain came in a blinding, roaring sheet. It wasn't water, but a solid force, drumming on the shingles of the little house with such fury Maeve feared they would tear free. Lightning clawed at the ridges, and the thunder that followed was the sound of the world splitting in two. She stood at the window, a cold knot of dread tightening in her stomach, watching as her world dissolved into grey chaos. And then, through the watery veil, she saw it. A section of the old split-rail fence that held her small herd in the lower pasture gave up its long fight. A lightning strike had shattered a post, and the relentless wind took the rails, tumbling them like kindling. The cows, panicked by the storm and sensing freedom, pushed through the gap, their dark shapes melting into the downpour. A cry escaped her, lost in the storm's howl. Those animals were her life. Their milk, their future calves, they were the fragile thread holding her to this land. To lose them was to lose everything. She threw on her husband's old oilskin coat, which swallowed her frame, and plunged into the tempest. The mud was instant and greedy, sucking at her boots with each step. The rain needled her face, and the wind tried to steal her breath. She reached the broken fence, but it was a hopeless ruin. The rails were heavy, waterlogged, scattered. The post was splintered at its base. She could no more fix this than she could stop the rain. She stood there, soaked to the skin, shivering with cold and a despair so profound it felt like a physical weight, the water on her cheeks not entirely from the sky. That was when she saw him. A shape emerged from the grey curtain like a ghost resolving into solid form. A man on a tall, dark horse, both of them looking as if they were carved from the storm itself. The man sat straight in the saddle, his broad shoulders squared against the wind, a weathered duster dark with rain. He rode not around the chaos, but toward it, his gaze fixed on the broken fence and the small, defeated figure standing before it. He drew his horse up nearby, the animal snorting and stamping in the mud. Maeve took a step back, her hand going to the slick handle of the work knife at her belt. Strangers were rare, and rarely meant good news for a woman alone. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble that somehow cut through the storm's din. He touched the brim of his hat. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky themselves, took in the scene, the shattered fence, the empty pasture, her own bedraggled and frightened state. There was no pity in that look, only a quick, sharp understanding. "Fence is gone. Stock scattered," he stated, not asking. Maeve could only nod, her throat too tight for words. He swung down from the saddle with an easy grace that seemed impossible in the muck. He was even bigger on the ground, a full head and shoulders taller than her, his frame lean but powerful under the wet clothes. He didn't approach her, but went to the broken post, running a large, calloused hand over the splintered wood. "Can be mended," he said, turning back to her. "Needs fresh post. These rails'll set right again." He looked from the fence to her, his expression unreadable. "I can see it done. I'll need a hot meal for it. Nothing more." The offer hung between them in the lashing rain. A hot meal. It was so simple, so direct. Her mind raced with fear, a strange man, his size, the vulnerability of her home. But her eyes went back to the ragged hole in her fence, the emptiness beyond. Her need was greater than her fear. Yes, she heard herself say, the word whipped away by the wind. She cleared her throat, forced strength into her voice. Yes. There's stew. And a dry spot in the barn for your horse. A brief nod. That was all. Without another word, he set to work. He fetched an axe from his saddle and went straight for a young, straight pine at the pasture's edge. Maeve watched, mesmerized, as he swung the axe with a rhythm that was both mighty and effortless, the thwack of the blade biting into it a counterbeat to the thunder. He was a man in conversation with hard labor, and it was a language he spoke fluently. He hauled the new post, trimmed and sharpened, to the hole as if it were a mere stick. She tried to help with the rails, but her hand slipped on the wet wood, her strength a puny thing next to his. He didn't tell her to stop, but whenever a rail was too heavy or awkwardly placed, his hand was there, his arm brushing hers, taking the weight from her. His touch, even through layers of soggy wool, was startlingly warm. They worked in near silence, the storm their only conversation. He would give short, clear instructions, hold this end, step back, ma'am, this one's slick, and she would follow. As the fence slowly came back together, so too did a tiny, fragile sense of order in her world. The raw panic receded, replaced by a wary, watchful calm. By the time the last rail was slotted home, the storm was walking away to the east, grumbling as it went. A pale, washed-out light emerged. They stood on opposite sides of the repaired fence, both filthy, breathing hard, steam rising from their clothes in the cool air. The cows, seeing their escape closed, began to wander back, lowing softly. He leaned on the top rail, looking at his work, then at her. Mud streaked his strong jaw. That'll hold. Thank you, Maeve said, and the words felt terribly small for the salvation he'd just brought. A deal's a deal, he said simply. He gathered his tools and his horse. I'll see to my animal. Then, if it still suits, that stew. She led the way to the barn, a new kind of nervousness fluttering in her chest. It wasn't the fear of the storm or losing everything now. It was the quiet, unsettling awareness of the large, quiet man walking behind her, and the warm light of her own kitchen window glowing in the gathering dusk. For the first time in a very long while, the house would not be empty. And as she stirred the pot over the fire, listening to the soft sounds of him tending to his horse in her barn, she realized the deep silence she'd lived in had been broken, and she wasn't at all sure she wanted it back. The dawn that followed the storm was a clean, scrubbed thing. A pale gold light spilled over the dripping ranch, and the air smelled of wet earth and pine, sharp and new. Maeve woke not to the hollow silence she was used to, but to the distant, steady thunk of an axe. She rose, wrapping a shawl around her nightdress, and went to the window. There, in the yard, was the stranger, Levi. He had already stacked the split wood from yesterday and was now attacking a massive, gnarled old stump she'd long given up as part of the landscape. Each swing of the axe was a model of perfect, contained power, the muscles of his back and shoulders rolling beneath his sweat-damp shirt with a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. He worked as if he had always been there, as if this morning chore was his born right. The sight sent a peculiar warmth through her, a feeling both foreign and thrilling. She dressed quickly, the practical calico and apron feeling different on her skin this morning, as if she were dressing for an audience. By the time she had the coffee boiling and bacon sizzling in the pan, the thunking had ceased. He appeared at the doorframe, filling it, hat in his hands. He had washed at the pump, his face was clean, his dark hair damp and curling at the temples. "Morning," he said, his voice a low gravel from the morning's work. "Morning." "Breakfast is ready," she replied, her own voice sounding too bright in her ears. They ate at the small kitchen table, a careful space between them. The silence was not empty, though. It was filled with the clink of forks, the sip of coffee, and the immense, unspoken fact of his presence. He ate with a slow, focused appreciation, cleaning his plate. May found herself watching his hands, large, capable, crisscrossed with fine white scars and calluses that caught the light. They were hands that could shatter a stump, yet they held the tin coffee cup with a surprising gentleness. "Fence looks good," she finally said, to break the spell. "Needs a second brace on the south corner," he said, looking up. His storm cloud eyes met hers. "Won't take but an hour." "Then, I spotted your north pasture gate hanging by a hinge. A good shove from a restless bull, and it's gone." He stated these facts plainly, not as criticism, but as a list of tasks awaiting a capable man. It was an unspoken offer to extend his stay. May felt a flutter of that earlier nervousness. Letting him stay another day was a risk of a different color than letting him fix a fence in a storm. It was an invitation into the rhythm of her life. Yet, the memory of his warm hand brushing hers in the rain, the solidity of him in her yard at dawn, argued against her caution. The list of chores he recited was the list of her constant, wearying worries. I would be grateful for the help," she said, the words tasting of both surrender and hope. "I can't pay more than meals and the barn." "Meals and the barn are plenty," he said, and a ghost of something, not quite a smile, but a softening, touched his eyes. The deal was struck. The day unfolded in a series of quiet, shared labors. He moved from task to task with an unhurried efficiency that fascinated her. He didn't just fix the gate, he reset the posts, dug out the rotten wood, and forged new nails at her small, disused forge, the firelight painting his focused face in tones of orange and shadow. Maeve worked nearby, weeding her kitchen garden, but her attention was perpetually drawn to him, the ripple of his forearms as he hammered, the way he would pause to wipe his brow with his sleeve, the solid line of his body against the vast backdrop of her land. In the afternoon, she needed to move the sacks of grain from the wagon bed into the storeroom. They were 50-pound sacks, and she had been dragging them, one exhausting tug at a time. She climbed into the wagon, gripped the rough burlap of the nearest sack, and braced herself for the struggle. Before she could strain, a shadow fell over her. Levi was there, at the side of the wagon. His presence was so immediate, so large, it stole the air from her lungs. He didn't climb up. He simply looked at her, his gaze intense and direct. "You've been doing this alone," he said, not as a question. His voice dropped, becoming a low, intimate rumble meant only for her, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the very core of her. "You've never met a man my size. Let me show you how it's done." The words were not a boast. They were a quiet statement of fact, a promise. He reached up, and his hands, those vast, scarred landscapes of labor, closed not on the sack, but over hers where they gripped the burlap. His touch was electric, a bolt of pure, shocking heat that shot up her arms and coiled deep in her belly. His skin was rough, but his hold was undeniably gentle, enveloping her completely. A small, breathless sound escaped her. She could only watch, frozen, as he carefully pried her fingers loose. Then, one hand slid past hers to grasp the neck of the sack. With a single, fluid motion that spoke of immense, leashed strength, he lifted the entire weight from the wagon bed as if it were a pillow, swung it easily onto his shoulder, and carried it into the storeroom. Maeve stood in the empty wagon, her hands still tingling where he had touched them. Her heart was a wild drum against her ribs. She felt the ghost of his warmth on her skin, the phantom pressure of his fingers. She looked at her own hands, small and chapped, and saw them anew, as something that could be covered, protected, awakened. The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze. Every ordinary sound, the bang of his hammer, the creak of the pump handle, seemed charged with new meaning. At supper, the space between them at the table felt charged, a live wire humming with unsaid things. Their eyes met more often, and the looks held a second longer. When his fingers brushed hers passing the salt jar, it was not an accident, and a flush rose up her neck. That night, alone in her bed, the memory would not let her rest. The cool sheets felt abrasive compared to the remembered heat of his touch. She lay in the dark, her body thrumming with a strange, restless energy. Slowly, almost without willing it, her own hand traveled up her arm, retracing the path his fingers had taken. But her own touch was a pale echo, a question without an answer. It only heightened the ache, the sudden, shocking hunger for the weight and warmth and roughness of a man who fixed fences and spoke in low whispers. The loneliness she had carried for so long had transformed. It was no longer a hollow absence, but a specific, yearning emptiness shaped exactly like him. The quiet of the house was different now. It was no longer a silence of absence, but a silence of waiting. And she, for the first time in years, was waiting for something. The sun on the third morning was a hammer of brass, beating down on the ranch with an intensity that had already baked the mud from the storm into a cracked, pale crust. The easy rhythm established the day before had deepened into something that felt, to Maeve, perilously close to normalcy. She found herself listening for the sound of his footsteps, timing her movements to coincide with his breaks, the steaming cup of coffee she brought him at mid-morning now a ritual that required no words, only the brief, warm brush of their fingers during the exchange. Levi had taken to mending the corral, his shirt discarded and hung on a post, his back and arms bare to the heavens. Maeve, hanging laundry on the line, felt the heat of the day not just from the sun, but from the sight of him, the powerful play of muscles under sun-browned skin, the trail of dark hair down his taut belly, the sheer physical reality of him that made her mouth go dry and her thoughts scatter like startled birds. It was in this state of flustered, secret observation that the peace shattered. The dog's bark was not its usual yap at a squirrel, but a sharp, warning alarm. A rider came into the yard at a fast trot, kicking up dust. He was a man named Jed Crowley, from a spread 2 valleys over. He was lean in a mean way, with eyes that darted like a snake's tongue and a smile that never touched them. Maeve's blood ran cold. Her husband had occasionally done business with Crowley, and it had never ended well. Maeve, Crowley said, not bothering to dismount, tipping his hat with a mocking flourish. Lonesome place for a woman all by her lonesome. I manage, Jed. What do you want? She kept her voice flat, wiping her hands on her apron, moving to stand between him and the house. Came to settle a debt, he said, his smile widening. Your late husband, God rest him, took $50 from me for a bull calf was never delivered. Time's come to collect. With interest. This was a lie. Maeve knew it in her bones. Her husband had been many things, but a thief wasn't one of them. This was Crowley seeing an opportunity, a vulnerable woman and a piece of land he'd always coveted. There's no debt, she said firmly, though her knees felt weak. You have no paper. My husband never mentioned it. A man's word is his bond, Maeve. Ain't no paper needed between neighbors. Crowley's voice took on a harder edge. He leaned forward in his saddle. $50, or we can talk about you signing over the south pasture to square it. That's fair, considerin' Dot. The threat hung in the air, ugly and final. Maeve felt a tremor begin in her hands. She was alone. The law was a 3-day ride away. Men like Crowley were the law out here. You'll leave now, she said, the words trembling. Crowley's fake smile vanished. He began to dismount, his intent clear, to intimidate, to push his way inside, to force the issue. Now, don't be difficult, woman. Let's discuss this in The sentence died in his throat. Levi had not made a sound. He was simply there. One moment he was by the corral, the next he stood between Maeve and the mounted man, having crossed the distance with a silent, predatory grace. He had not bothered with his shirt. He stood, feet planted wide in the dust, his broad chest and powerful arms gleaming with sweat, a stark, silent monument of opposition. In his right hand, held loosely at his side, was the heavy framing hammer he'd been using. It was not raised in threat, but its presence was undeniable. The air in the yard changed. It became thick, charged. Crowley froze, one foot in a stirrup, his eyes widening as he took in the sheer size of the man before him, the quiet, deadly promise in his posture. The lady said you'll leave, Levi spoke. His voice was not loud. It was low, flat, and colder than mountain runoff. It carried a finality that echoed louder than a shout. I'll hear you right out now. Crowley's bravado crumpled. He looked from Levi's impassive face to the hammer, to Maeve standing behind this human wall. He saw no bluff, only calm, ready force. Swallowing hard, he swung his leg back over the saddle, his face mottled with rage and fear. This ain't over, he spat, but the words were hollow, meant to save face. It is, Levi said, the two syllables falling like stones. If you come back, you won't ride away. You understand me? The threat was explicit, delivered with an eerie calm. Crowley understood. He yanked his horse's head around, dug in his spurs, and fled the yard in a cloud of shame and dust. The silence he left behind was deafening. The brave front Maeve had held shattered, and the delayed shock hit her like a physical blow. A violent tremble took hold of her entire body. The world swam, and she stumbled back a step. Then his hands were on her. Not the searing, deliberate touch from the wagon, but a firm, steadying grip on her shoulders. Easy now, Levi murmured, his voice transformed back into that low, warm rumble. He's gone. He won't be back. He guided her, his touch both strong and infinitely gentle, away from the yard, up the steps, and into the cool dimness of the house. She was shaking uncontrollably, the tears she'd held back now spilling over in hot, silent streams. He sat her in a chair at the table and knelt before her, his hands moving from her shoulders to cradle her trembling ones. He didn't tell her not to cry. He simply waited, his thumbs stroking slow, soothing circles on her skin, an anchor in the receding storm of her fear. When her shaking subsided to hiccups, she looked down at him. This giant of a man, who had just faced down a snake like Crowley without raising his voice, was on his knees before her, his eyes full of a concern so deep it made her heart ache in a new way. You saved me, she whispered, her voice raw. He was never gonna hurt you, Levi said, his gaze holding hers. Not while I draw breath. The truth of it, the absolute certainty in his words, melted the last of her terror. It was replaced by a wave of something so profound it stole her breath, a trust that was not just of the mind, but of the soul. This man was her sanctuary. Driven by a need greater than fear, greater than propriety, she lifted a hand. It was still trembling slightly as she brought it to his face. Her fingertips touched the rough plane of his cheek, tracing the hard line of his jaw, gritty with a day's growth of beard. It was an exploration, a claiming. At her touch, Levi closed his eyes. A shuddering breath escaped him, as if he'd been holding it for years. He turned his face into her palm, his lips pressing against her skin in a kiss that was more pledge than passion. That simple act broke the last dam within her. She slid from the chair, down to the floor with him, their knees touching and the dust motes dancing in a sunbeam. Her other hand came up to frame his face. She saw the question, the raw, restrained hunger in his stormy eyes, and she answered it. She leaned forward and brought her lips to his. The kiss began as a soft meeting, a tender seal of gratitude and trust. But the moment their lips touched, something primal and long dormant ignited. The tenderness exploded into a conflagration. His arms came around her, crushing her to the solid wall of his chest. Her fingers tangled in the dark hair at the nape of his neck. The kiss deepened, turning hot and desperate, a hungry exchange of breath and promise. She could taste the coffee they'd shared, the salt of his sweat, and something uniquely, fiercely him. It was a kiss that spoke of loneliness ended, of protection given and received, of a want that had grown silently in the shadow of shared labor and now roared into the light. When they finally broke apart, gasping for air, their foreheads resting together, the world had been remade. The house was no longer just a house. It was a fortress, and within its walls, something new and fearless had been born. The kiss was a door flung open, and there was no thought of closing it. The air in the little kitchen, still vibrating with the fading echo of Jed Crowley's threat, now hummed with a different, far more potent energy. The space between their bodies, once a careful chasm, had become an unbearable distance. When their lips parted, breath ragged, the look that passed between them held no question, only a single, blazing answer. Levi's hands, which had cradled hers with such tenderness, moved to her waist, his fingers pressing into the soft give of her calico dress as he stood, bringing her up with him in one fluid, powerful motion. Her feet barely touched the floorboards. His eyes, dark now as a midnight sky, searched her face, a final, silent plea for permission. Maeve answered by weaving her fingers more tightly through his hair and pulling his mouth back to hers. It was all the assent he needed. He did not carry her to the bedroom as if she were fragile china. He lifted her against his chest, her body aligned with the hard, warm length of his, and walked with a deliberate, possessive stride through the doorway into the shadowed hall. Her bedroom was a place of solitude, a chapel of quiet grief and lonely sleep. When he shouldered the door open and crossed its threshold, he was not an intruder, but a conquering king claiming a long-abandoned kingdom. The afternoon sun sliced through the window, painting a bar of gold across the simple quilt. He set her on her feet beside the bed, but did not release her. His hands came up to frame her face, his touch achingly reverent. "Maeve," he breathed, her name a prayer on his lips, and kissed her again, slowly, deeply, drinking her in as a man dying of thirst. This kiss was a promise, a prelude. It spoke of time, of patience, of an intent to worship every inch of her. His large, work-roughened fingers found the first button at the nape of her dress. The pop of each button being freed was a tiny explosion in the quiet room. He was painstakingly slow, his knuckles brushing the sensitive skin of her spine, sending shivers racing across her flesh. The dress loosened, its practical weight surrendering to his persistence, until it pooled in a worn calico circle at her feet. Her simple cotton shift followed, leaving her standing in the striped sunlight in only her thin chemise and drawers. The cool air raised goosebumps on her skin, but the heat of his gaze warmed her more thoroughly than any fire. He stepped back, just a pace, to look at her. There was no artful seduction in her pose, only the honest, vulnerable truth of a woman's body shaped by hard work and solitude. Yet, under his gaze, she felt not exposed, but seen. Truly seen, for the first time. His eyes traced the curve of her shoulder, the swell of her breasts against the plain linen, the gentle dip of her waist, the strong lines of her legs. A low sound, part groan, part benediction, rumbled in his chest. "God above," he whispered, his voice thick. You are a vision. The raw appreciation in his words melted the last of her shyness. Emboldened, she reached for him. Her fingers fumbled with the buttons of his trousers, her own courage thrilling her. He helped her, his hands covering hers for a moment before shedding the coarse fabric. Then, he pulled his union suit over his head in one swift motion, and stood before her, fully revealed. Maeve's breath caught. She had seen the strength of him from a distance, the power in his arms and back. But this was different. This was the unadorned truth of the man. The broad, sculpted chest dusted with dark hair that trailed down over the hard planes of his abdomen. The powerful thighs, the strong column of his neck. And between his legs, the proud, thick evidence of his desire for her. He was magnificent, not like a statue, but like a force of nature, a mountain, a river, something elemental and real. A flicker of nervousness returned, not of fear, but of awe at the sheer, potent masculinity of him. He saw it, and understood. "I'll go slow," he murmured, his hand coming to cup her cheek. "I'll show you. All of it." And he did. He led her to the bed, the quilt soft beneath her back as he followed her down, covering her not with his full weight, but with the heat of his body. His mouth left hers to trail a path of fire down her throat, his tongue tracing the frantic beat of her pulse. He peeled the chemise from her shoulders, baring her breasts to the sun-warmed air and the heat of his mouth. When he took a peaked nipple into his mouth, suckling gently, then with a firmer, rhythmic pressure, a bolt of pure, white-hot pleasure shot straight to the core of her, and she cried out, arching beneath him. His hands were everywhere, learning her. They swept down the curve of her ribcage, gripped the swell of her hip, slid the final barrier of her drawers down her legs. His touch was both confident and curious, mapping the landscape of her as if committing it to eternal memory. He kissed his way down her trembling stomach, over the gentle curve of her belly, and lower still. When his mouth found the most intimate part of her, she nearly leapt from the bed, a shock of such intense, unfamiliar sensation rocketing through her. "Levi." His name was a gasp, a plea. "Shoo," he soothed, his hands holding her hips gently but firmly. "This, too. Let me show you this." And he did. With a patient, focused tenderness that utterly belied his size and strength, he loved her with his mouth, his tongue weaving a spell of building, coiling tension until she was mindless, clutching at the quilt, her breaths coming in sobbing gasps. The world narrowed to the point where his mouth touched her, to the gathering storm inside her. It broke with a force that shook her to her soul, a wave of release so powerful it washed away every last remnant of the past, leaving her boneless and trembling, tears of sheer overwhelm leaking from the corners of her eyes. Before the last tremor had subsided, he was moving up her body, his skin slick against hers. He settled between her thighs, his weight now a welcome, solid pressure. He was thick and hard against her, and she felt a new, delicious tension gathering. He looked into her eyes, his own face strained with the effort of his control. "Look at me," he breathed. "Look at me when I come into you." She held his stormy gaze, her heart in her throat. With one slow, inexorable push, he filled her. There was a fleeting, stretching burn, quickly swallowed by a sensation of such profound rightness it stole her breath. He was deep, so deep, connecting parts of her that had been lonely and separate for a lifetime. He stilled, buried fully within her, his body trembling with the force of holding back. "Maeve," he groaned, a sound of agony and ecstasy. She answered by wrapping her legs around his hips, pulling him deeper still. It was all the invitation he needed. He began to move. It was not a frantic, hurried rhythm, but the same powerful, measured cadence he used to swing an axe or split a log, a timeless, primal pace that was meant to last. Each stroke was a revelation, a friction that stoked the embers of her pleasure back into a blazing fire. She met him, thrust for thrust, learning the rhythm of him, her nails digging into the hard muscles of his back. The room filled with the sounds of their joining, the soft slap of skin, the creak of the bed ropes, his guttural groans against her neck, her own keening cries. He showed her how a man loves a woman. Not as a quick taking, but as a shared journey. He showed her with the depth of his thrusts, the clutch of his hands, the whispered, broken words of praise against her skin, so perfect, so beautiful, my Maeve. He showed her by watching her face as she climbed again, her eyes flying open, her mouth forming a silent "oh" as a second, even more shattering peak overtook her. The sight of her pleasure shattered his famed control. With a final, deep thrust and a ragged shout that was her name, he found his own release, pulsing within her, the two of them locked together as the last of the sunlight gilded their sweat-slicked skin. For a long time, there was only the sound of their breathing slowing, and the beat of their hearts in tandem. He rolled, taking her with him, keeping her nestled against his side, her head on his chest. She could hear the strong, steady drum of his heart under her ear. His hand stroked her hair, her arm, as if he couldn't stop touching her. In the quiet, golden aftermath, the word whispered in her soul, not with fear, but with a quiet, unshakable certainty. It was no longer just his body inside hers, but the truth of him, taking root. He was home. And as his breathing deepened into sleep, she knew with a clarity that outshone the setting sun, that the lone cowboy was lone no more. The light of the fifth morning did not wake them, they were already awake. They had spent the night in a fitful, beautiful tangle of limbs and whispered discoveries, sleeping only in brief, sated snatches before the warmth of the other's skin or the memory of a touch would rouse them again, leading to slow, drowsy lovemaking in the deep quiet before dawn. When the first true rays of sun painted the room in hues of peach and gray, Maeve lay with her head on Levi's chest, her fingers tracing idle patterns through the dark hair she found there. His arm was a heavy, comforting weight around her, his hand splayed possessively on the curve of her hip. The silence between them was no longer something to be filled, but a rich, shared substance, softer than any blanket. He stirred finally, pressing a kiss into her tousled hair before slipping from the bed. She watched him, the powerful, unself-conscious grace of his naked body moving in the dim light as he pulled on his trousers. He left the room and returned minutes later with 2 steaming cups of coffee. He handed her one and sat on the edge of the bed, his eyes drinking her in as she sat up, the quilt pulled around her waist. They drank in that quiet communion, a new ritual born of intimacy. The steam from the cups mingled in the sunbeam between them. The day unfolded not as a series of chores, but as a long, sweet epilogue to the storm of the days before. There was a new ease to their movements, a silent conversation in every glance. His hand would find the small of her back as she passed him at the wash basin. She would lean into him, just for a moment, as she set a plate before him at the table. The air itself seemed to shimmer with the afterglow of their joining. They worked, but the work was different. He repaired the hinge on the barn door, and she sat on an upturned bucket nearby, shelling peas, her presence a quiet audience he no longer pretended not to need. Every so often, he would look up, his gaze finding hers, and something warm and unspoken would pass between them, a secret thread stitching their souls tighter. As the afternoon sun began its long slide toward the western ridges, a palpable change came over Levi. A quietness that was not peace, but preoccupation, settled on his broad shoulders. Maeve felt it like a shift in the wind. She saw him pause by the corral, looking out over the vast, empty land that led to the distant road, the road that had brought him here, the road that led everywhere else. A cold knot, entirely separate from the day's warmth, formed in her stomach. The unspoken truth they had avoided for 2 days now stood between them, as large and real as he was. He was a wandering man. The work here was done. The fence was mended, the predator seen off. A cowboy's life was one of motion. He came to her as she was pinning the last of the laundry, his own shirt, now clean, flapping in the breeze beside her dresses. He stood behind her, so close she could feel the heat of him. His hands came to rest on her shoulders, his thumbs kneading the tension she hadn't realized she was holding there. "Maeve," he said, his voice low. "I need to say something." She closed her eyes, bracing for the goodbye, her heart beginning a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. She felt him turn her gently to face him. His expression was solemn, etched with a vulnerability she had never seen there before. "I rode into this yard with nothing but a saddle and a need for a meal," he began, his eyes searching hers, begging her to understand. "I meant to ride out the same way. But this place, it's got a hold on me now. A hold I don't want to break." He took a deep, ragged breath. "The thought of getting back on that road, of not seeing your face across the table, of not hearing this door shut behind me at the end of the day, it feels like leaving my own heart buried in the dust." He cupped her face, his touch infinitely tender. "I ain't a man of pretty words. I'm a man of dirt and sweat and simple things. The simplest, truest thing I know is that I love you, Maeve. Not as a passing fancy. Not as a thank you for a warm bed. I love you as a man loves the woman he wants to build his life around. So I'm asking you. Not to be your hired hand. But to be your husband. To be your partner on this land, in this house, in this bed. For all my days." The words hung in the air, not as a question, but as a solemn offer, a laying down of arms. The cold knot in Maeve's stomach dissolved, replaced by a warmth that spread from her core outward, until she felt lit from within. Tears, but these of pure, unadulterated joy, welled in her eyes and spilled over. She saw her own future reflected in his earnest, fearful eyes, not a lonely stretch of identical days, but a shared path, rich with struggle and sure reward, warmed by this steadfast, magnificent man. She did not hesitate. She reached up, pulling his head down to hers, kissing him with all the love and acceptance bursting inside her. "Yes," she breathed against his lips. "Yes, Levi. 1,000 times, yes. Stay. Build with me. Love me." The relief that washed over his face was a sunrise all its own. He crushed her to him, laughing, a rich, full sound she had never heard from him before, and she laughed with him, the sound mingling with the wind in the laundry. The next morning, he did not pick up his axe to tackle a chore of hers. Instead, he went to a stand of straight, strong pines at the far edge of the property. He felled 2, trimmed them, and with mighty, sure swings of his maul, split them into rails. He was not fixing her fence anymore. He was extending it, building a new pen, a stronger, larger one for the herd they would grow together. Maeve watched from the porch, a cup of coffee cooling in her hands, her heart so full it felt too large for her chest. He worked with a new purpose, a man no longer passing through, but putting down roots as deep as the posts he was setting. He was no longer the lone cowboy. He was Levi, her Levi. And she was no longer the widow, bravely holding a lonely line against the world. She was Maeve, a woman loved, a woman chosen, a woman who had found an unexpected and forever love in the wake of a storm. Did this tale of a lonely heart finding shelter in the strength of a stranger's arms stir something in you? The frontier holds countless more stories of passion forged in hardship, of love blooming in the unlikeliest soil. If you yearn to lose yourself in another world where desire is as raw and real as the wilderness itself, consider seeking out more such tales. Your next adventure in romance awaits just a subscription away.